Welcome to Lincoln Fire and Rescue. I'm Dale Johnson. Imagine you are in a restaurant, crowded restaurant, having lunch with a few friends, and you hear a siren in the distance, and you think to yourself, I wonder where they're going. I wonder what's happening. The siren gets louder, the siren gets closer, and then you see a fire engine turn into the parking lot and park right in front of the crowded restaurant where you are having lunch. That's when you learn that right next door, someone is unconscious after suffering a cardiac arrest. If you only knew CPR, if you only knew what was going on at the end of that siren call, maybe you could have made a difference. Today we talk about an app that you can download on your smartphone, which connects people trained in CPR with people suffering cardiac arrest. It's here in Lincoln. It's called PulsePoint. City Public Safety Director Tom Cassidy joins me today to talk about PulsePoint. Tom, thank you very much.
Hi, Dale. My pleasure. And you know, that story you just told is the story of Richard Price, the fire chief that really conceived the idea of PulsePoint.
And it can happen. It could happen this afternoon when we walk outside.
It actually happened to Chief Price. He was the fire chief in San Ramon Valley, California, which is suburban San Francisco Bay Area. And he was having lunch in a deli when that happened right next door, and it was his own fire trucks approaching. He didn't know that until it was too late. And he thought there ought to be a way to get this kind of information to people that are carrying smartphones.
You been around someone who's suffered an episode, cardiac arrest?
Several times. A couple on duty as a police officer, and then twice off duty. You know, it's just critical to get CPR started with the victim of a sudden cardiac arrest. It dramatically increases their chance of survival. Bystander CPR is one of the critical factors in the chain of survival.
In my mind, initially, CPR includes breaths and pulses on the chest. They've done away with the breaths
Right now,
aspect, haven't they?
For the most part, what's taught today is called hands-only CPR.
Right.
That's what the American Heart Association generally teaches. It's much, much simpler than when you and I learned it back in our youth. About anyone can do CPR. In fact, it takes very little instruction to know the basics, and even the basics can save a life. Now, it's good to get training, don't get me wrong. So if you can take a 1 hour or a 2 hour or 4 hour course from the American Red Cross, for example, that's always a good thing. But we talk people through CPR that have had no training over the telephone several times every year, Dale. And the American Heart Association has about a 30-second video on their website to teach you the basics of hands-only CPR.
The PulsePoint doesn't teach CPR. It just tells a person who's downloaded the app onto their smartphone where an episode is taking place. Is that correct?
That's correct. The concept behind PulsePoint is to deliver to citizens who are willing to help a message that tells them that near them, within about a quarter mile, there is a victim suffering sudden cardiac arrest in a public place. And those citizens are anonymous. No one knows who they are or whether they actually responded or not. The app doesn't require that you set up an account. It doesn't require a username. It doesn't collect your phone number. All it does is sit there on your phone in between Candy Crush and Angry Birds until it's needed. And when it's needed, it'll deliver that alert to you and tell you that someone nearby needs CPR.
Right, citizens, I know they're thinking, well, the fire department, the ambulance pulls up right away. It seems like it's just a couple of minutes. In reality, it's more. But let's spend a few minutes talking about why time matters.
Time matters, Dale, because in a life-threatening medical emergency like cardiac arrest, the outcome is dependent on how quickly responders get to you and start helping. In cardiac arrest, 4 minutes passes without any kind of bystander CPR. The likelihood is that your brain will start to lose some of its capacity and function. Brain cells will die. The longer that goes on, the lower your chance of survival. And it doesn't take very long before you're actually a goner. And you know, we get there pretty quickly in Lincoln. We're blessed to live in an urban area here with a well-funded and well-equipped fire and rescue department. But the fact of the matter is that even in the best of circumstances, 6 minutes can pass pretty easily before a paramedic is at your side. And that's just too long. So your chance of survival is really largely dependent on whether or not the cardiac arrest is witnessed by someone and whether or not there are people there that are willing to help you until the paramedics arrive.
How long has PulsePoint been available in Lincoln?
PulsePoint was launched here in Lincoln on October 8th, so we're the first city in this four-state region consisting of Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri to launch PulsePoint. It's in use in over 1,000 communities around the United States, but we're kind of the first one in this region. One of the things I'm hoping is that our experience can encourage other EMS providers in this area to look into PulsePoint and implement it in their own communities.
You had some expectations going in. Have those expectations been met or exceeded?
Dale, the PulsePoint Foundation sets a goal for their new clients of reaching 1% of their population within the first year. 1% of Lincoln's population is 2,730, and we blew by that in the first week after our launch. So my personal goal has been to reach 5,000 citizens in Lincoln with PulsePoint in our first year, and we're getting close to hitting that even though we're only about 90 days into the launch.
4,500 or so, nearly 5,000 in. Any person responded to PulsePoint to save a life or to implement CPR yet?
Yes, we've already had several of those. We're going to have here in Lincoln, on average, about 4 incidents per month that are cardiac arrest cases that occur in public places. Because of HIPAA privacy laws, we can only deliver these alerts when the cardiac arrest happens in a public place like a school or a restaurant or a church or an office building. And we'll have about 4 incidents that meet that criteria here in Lincoln in any given month. We had a very interesting incident in one of our elementary schools real soon after our launch where it was a 9 or 10-year-old boy stopped breathing. PulsePoint alert went off. There were 2 citizens that were within a quarter mile of that showed up at the door of the school ready to help. In fact, they even directed the principal to a business down the street that had an AED in case that was needed, and the principal went down and retrieved the AED. Now, in this case, fortunately, CPR wasn't needed, but it's a good indicator that there are people out there who are willing to help in these kinds of emergencies. We had another incident downtown. Unfortunately, it wasn't survivable, but in that incident, 31 different people received the alert, and at least a few of those responded to the scene to see if they could help.
Any place, where I'm going is only public places? You mentioned a school, that's a public place. What about a private office? How far does PulsePoint cast its net?
PulsePoint cannot send an alert if the cardiac arrest happens at a private residence because that's a violation of federal privacy laws. So these alerts will only come to your phone if you're within a quarter mile and if the cardiac arrest happens in basically a public place. In an intersection, a vehicle on the street, a motel, an office, a store, a restaurant, any place that's in the database is a public place.
I have PulsePoint, don't have the CPR feature. I use it for the traffic alerts and LFR calls.
Mm-hmm. A really nice feature of PulsePoint is the ability to get other kinds of alerts, not just cardiac arrest. So here's how PulsePoint works. The app is tied into our 911 communications center. The computer-aided dispatch software there is connected to the PulsePoint application. So as soon as that 911 call has been transferred from the call taker who answered 911 to the dispatcher, it also goes to PulsePoint at the same time. So actually you'll generally receive PulsePoint alerts before the dispatcher has even been able to say the words. It's very, very fast. And since it's tied into all of the Lincoln Fire and Rescue dispatches, the app also provides you with information about all of those dispatches. So you can see a running list of what the fire department's responding to now. If you hear sirens, you can look at the app and see where the fire department is headed. And you can subscribe to other kinds of calls for alerts. And the big one for me are the traffic crashes. Mm-hmm. Injury traffic crashes are the kinds that the fire and rescue department responds to, not just fender benders. And those are almost always pretty big disruption of traffic because you've got the big fire apparatus, the medic unit, ambulance, police responding. And it's a great way to get an early alert on a traffic collision. And I've used it several times personally to avoid a snarl in traffic that I would have encountered otherwise.
Mm-hmm. It's free to me to download. It's free to you. It's free to anybody to download. What's the maintenance costs, or what did it cost the city to bring in PulsePoint?
Well, first we had to pay the cost of creating the connection between PulsePoint and our computer-aided dispatch software. That was about $30,000. That's a one-time cost, though. And now going forward, we'll have an annual cost based on our population. And I think that's about $5,000 per year for us to be a PulsePoint connected community. And I think it's already been worth the investment on our part, just for this feature of providing alerts to citizens about potential traffic collisions, structure fires, another kind of call that often creates a pretty big traffic snarl. And you know, it's just a great app to have, and as you mentioned, it's free. And a lot of people are concerned about their privacy these days. They're concerned about apps that are collecting information about them. PulsePoint is entirely anonymous. You will never provide PulsePoint with any of your personal information. No account to set up, no phone number to provide, no email address to enter. It simply works by using the location services on your phone and comparing that with the location of the incident and delivering you that alert based on your location, not based on your identity.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom, because people might think, well, they're collecting data on me or on my phone use or maybe on my location at the other end.
Yeah.
That's not the case.
It's not the case, Dale. And I've also noticed that it doesn't seem to use very much data, and it doesn't seem to use very much battery. So some people are concerned about conserving their battery, and some applications use quite a bit of power and quite a bit of data. But my personal experience with PulsePoint is that it does not. So I'm hoping that everyone that has a smartphone here in Lincoln thinks about downloading a PulsePoint and then following Lincoln Fire and Rescue. And you may travel to other cities that are PulsePoint connected, and you can always follow those cities during your travels as well. But when you think about the opportunity here to be part of that chain of survival for the victim of a cardiac arrest, it's really a pretty phenomenal application.
There are different apps. Is there which app applies to Lincoln? You go on the App Store, you go on Google Store, Google Play, and there are different PulsePoint apps. Which one applies to Lincoln?
You will find some other applications in Google and in Apple that use the word PulsePoint somewhere in their name. The one you want is red. It's easy to find. Just search for PulsePoint, look for the app with the red icon, and that's the one that you want. And as I say, I'm hoping we can get a lot of people here in Lincoln to download this app. Another nice feature in the application, Dale, is we've included an internet feed of the 911 center's radio traffic to first responders. So you can toggle on the radio feed and listen to the traffic that's being dispatched on the radio to and from police officers and firefighters that are responding. And you can do that for a few seconds and generally see whether this is a big deal or not so big a deal. So it's a real nice scanner app on top of everything else.
Tom, we're used to the time when scanners were this big, or you held one that was this big as a brick.
Dale, you've got a long history in news here in Lincoln, and I'll tell you what, for reporters that are doing spot news, this app is very helpful. I've heard from several reporters that are really appreciating the fact that they're getting these alerts and can just toggle on the scanner if they want to see what's going on in any more detail.
Where do you see this going? Where do you see PulsePoint providing additional service? What are the options and the expandability of this?
Well, first of all, I think PulsePoint's going to spread like wildfire. It already is. When I first got interested in PulsePoint, there were 34 PulsePoint connected communities. There are over 1,000 today, so it's grown by leaps and bounds just within the past year and a half or 2 years. That's going to continue. I think it will be very widespread in a very short time period. Lots of implementations occurring every single week in the United States. But it has an underlying concept that I think will also be interesting to watch, and that's the concept of delivering information directly to a mobile device, sort of cutting out the dispatcher. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story. I was at an event that I had just arrived at one day, and I saw a group of my firefighters running towards their rig, and it was Captain Dan Ripley and his crew from Engine 3. And they were on the trot And Captain Ripley was saying, let's go. And they were driving out of the parking lot where this event was occurring when I heard the radio dispatch. And it was a fire at a establishment here, a restaurant in Northwest Lincoln. And they had actually gotten that alert on their smartphones through PulsePoint before the dispatcher was able to find some clear airtime and actually voice the dispatch over the radio. So I have a feeling that we're going to see this concept of direct push to mobile devices become more and more common in public safety dispatching. I don't think it'll make dispatchers obsolete by any stretch of the imagination, but it is going to change the nature of the work somewhat. So although it's being used now for these CPR alerts, I can see a day coming in the not too distant future where dispatches are being pushed automatically to nearby first responders and then followed up with voice instructions or additional details via the radio from the dispatcher.
Does that bother you in some way that the public has this greater access to scanner information? I know years ago the city went to a radio system that fragmented up the messages from channel to channel so that it was more difficult to get some of the dispatch information. Now we're receiving it on our cell phone.
Well, first of all, there's been a huge proliferation in smartphone apps and the use of these apps to listen to scanner feeds. There are a lot of different apps that will do that. There's a nationwide database of internet published public safety radio feeds called radioreference.com. Lots of people are listening in now that a generation ago would have been a small number. They would have had to have special expertise and expensive equipment. And I think we've just learned to live with that in the public safety field. We publish our own internet feed, so we're not relying on some hobbyists to republish to the internet the audio from their scanners, which is what most places are doing. Instead, we publish an official feed, and we have a little bit more control over that. We can designate which of our many channels and talk groups is published in that feed. In fact, that's why we publish the feed. We want people to know what we're doing to some extent, but by publishing our own feed, we can make sure that things that aren't appropriate, like our tactical channels, for example, and the channels that we're transmitting information back and forth with the hospitals are not on that public feed that we publish. And our hope was that by publishing a public feed, we could satisfy some of that demand out there for scanner listeners, and at the same time avoid the situation where a hobbyist who's not as familiar with our operations might be publishing the audio from some of the channels that really aren't appropriate.
So here's your invitation, everyone. Let's have as many people involved as you can. Just go to the App Store. It's the Red app, Red
PulsePoint, one word.
App.
One word, so search for PulsePoint, one word. If you see multiples, and you'll see two, last time I checked in iTunes, and maybe three in Google Play, you're looking for the red icon. It'll be pretty obvious to you which one is the PulsePoint app.
All right. Thank you, Tom, very much.
Thank you, Dale.
And thanks, Lincoln, for becoming involved in this and making it such a success. City Public Safety Director Tom Cassidy joining me on Lincoln Fire and Rescue.
incredible rescue, all thanks to a very smart app for your smartphone. A Washington State man springing into action. We got
PulsePoint is active in Lincoln and free in the App Store. Download it today. You could be the one.